In this video, we're going to explore how to write our own methods and learn the proper syntax that we can use to create our own methods in our Java programs. In order to write your own method, you first need to have an algorithm that you'd like to encapsulate into a method. Encapsulate is just a fancy word that means group all of the instructions together along with a name so that you're easily able to call that name to launch those instructions in your program. In Java, methods are usually included at the bottom of your .java file, so that's where we'll put them. If you're writing your own method, you need to think through at least three things. These include what you want to name or call your method. You also need to know the information that you're expecting to use as arguments for your method. Whenever you're designing your method, you'll need to make sure that it accepts parameters that match up with those argument requirements. And we'll need to know both the number and the data type of the expected parameters. And then finally, you'll need to know whether the method that you're writing returns a value. In addition to these three specific items, you'll have to have an algorithm in mind that you're going to encapsulate in the method. We're going to look at an example, but first, let's look at the syntax for declaring a method in Java. If you're writing a method in your main.java file, your method should have this format. It should have the reserved word public and then the reserved word static. We're going to talk about what those mean eventually, but for now, just put those in your method definitions in your main.java file. Then you'll need to list your return type for your method and the identifier that you've selected for your method name. Finally, as the last part of the method header, you'll want to include parentheses that include all of the different parameters that your method expects. This is your way of signaling that your method needs to be called with arguments when somebody wants to launch it into action. After this top line, which we often refer to as the method signature, then you can begin the body of the method, which is always included inside curly brackets. So you include all of your different instructions that you want to encapsulate into this method with your selected identifier here. Let's write a method for something that's familiar. Remember a few weeks ago, we wrote some instructions that allowed us to look at a monogram and test to see whether it was a valid monogram, where monograms have 3 characters and each of the characters are letters. So something like ABC would be a valid monogram, but something like A72 wouldn't be a valid monogram because it doesn't contain all letters. And something like ABCDE would not be a valid monogram because it contains more than 3 characters. So we'll create a method that allows us to check a string to see if it's a valid monogram. Before we start writing our code, let's think through our 3 items. What will we want to call our method? You can pick any identifier that's valid in Java. I'm going to call mine isValid. If you wanted to call it isValid monogram or monogram checker or something else, that would be completely fine too. The choice of the identifier is yours. Next, we need to think through, does the method require information in order to accomplish its goal? So do we need specific data in order to check if something's a monogram? Yes, we need to know what the string is that we're checking. And then finally, we need to think through whether this particular method might produce information that needs to be communicated back to our main program as a return value. In this case, our isValid method will return information. It figures out whether the monogram is or isn't valid. So it's going to return a Boolean value. Now that we have those basic pieces of information sorted out, let's go ahead and write our method implementation. Remember that if we're writing a method in main, we always want to start with public and then static. Then the return type for our method, we said our method's going to return a Boolean value. So I'm going to type bool here as the return value. Next, I need to include the name of my method. I picked the name isValid. You can use your own name instead if you'd like. And then inside parentheses, we need to include the data type and name for each of our expected values that come from outside this method. we said we're going to have one piece of information that comes from outside, and it represents the monogram to check. So I'm going to say string, and then I'm going to call it just value. All right, awesome. And now I'm going to include the body of my method inside parentheses. I got like 3 fonts going on here. All right, so then I'm going to include parentheses that delimit the body of my method. And remember, this line that we just wrote, that's called the method signature. It gives you all the information you need to know about the method. All of the code that's included in this algorithm belongs in here inside the method body. We'll write the actual implementation of our method in just a moment. You'll see it looks just like writing regular Java code. So we can use if statements and loops and variable declarations and arithmetic expressions, all the things we can use anywhere else in our Java program to carry out our algorithm that is encapsulated inside this method. Now let's turn our attention to calling the method that we wrote. The syntax to call a method that you wrote is identical to the syntax that we use to call library methods, but we'll use the class name main instead of an object name because you can't instantiate the main class in any Java project. So when we're calling our methods, it'll look like this, where we say the word main, that's the name of our class, and then dot method name, that's whatever you called your method, and then include all of the arguments, the pieces of information that you're going to pass into your method. If your method has a return value, you'll need to capture that return value by saving the value that comes back from the method in some variable in your main program. In this way, the arguments and the return value allow you to communicate information back and forth between these 2 different pieces of your project, the main method and other methods that you might write and included in your solution. If you're calling a method and it's in the same file as the class that you're writing, then you don't have to include the word main and the period. You can leave it out, and Java will automatically assume that you're calling a method that's part of this specific class. So if you're writing your main class and you're trying to call your isValid method for your monogram, you can just say isValid. You don't necessarily have to say main.isValid. Sometimes people like to write the main dot in there just so that they remember that anytime you're calling a method, you need to use that syntax with the object and then a dot before the method name. And it just helps them to be consistent. All right, let's transition and look at an example file. So I created an example Java file. Let's just take a look at what I have so far. So I've set it up so that we can use input. I got all my good stuff in there for the scanner. And in this program, I'm creating a loop that repeats 5 times. So I'm using a count controlled for loop. And then each time through the loop, I'm asking the user to enter a possible monogram, and I'm storing that in a string called mono. And then I have some code in here that's checking to see if the string is a valid monogram. So I'm testing to see if its length is 3 and if each of the individual characters in that monogram is a letter. And I'm using that character.isLetter method that we used when we wrote that process a few weeks ago. In addition to checking if something's a monogram, I also want to print out a message saying that the string that we're testing is or isn't a valid monogram. So I have some code for that down here towards the bottom of my main method. So this all looks great, but suppose that I think like, hey, this is kind of clunky to have all these details about monogram checking in here. Maybe instead of having these individual statements about checking to see if there's a monogram, I just want to call a method. I'm going to capture all the logic about checking to see if something is a valid monogram in this method that I'm creating. So again, I took my logic that I used to have here in my main program, and now I just want to reorganize my code, kind of like you would if you were revising a term paper to create more paragraphs or add section headings or something like that. This is the same kind of organizational structure, not necessarily changing what the outcome of the program is. I'm still going to have the same behavior. I'm just going to write things so that they're a little bit more modular. So I'm going to add my method body down here at the bottom. And again, it always starts with the reserved words public static. And then the return type for the method, we said we're writing it to have a Boolean return type. And then I want to put in the name of my method. I said I'm going to call mine is valid. And then I'm going to include my parameters. These are like placeholder values that I can use inside my method body to carry out the logic of my algorithm. So I said I'm going to create one parameter in here, and I'm calling it value. All right, so now suppose that I had a string variable and it was called value. How would I check to see if value was a valid monogram? My outcome from this method is going to be a true or false value. So I'm going to declare that first. And I'm just going to initialize it to false, just assuming that the value of the monogram isn't a monogram. And then if it happens to be a monogram, I'll change the value of the variable result. So to check if my string value is a monogram, I'm first going to test to see if its length is equal to 3. Because if it doesn't have a length of 3, then I know that it's not a valid monogram. And then I'm also going to check to see if each of the characters in my string is a letter. Here I'm checking to see if the first character in my string value, the one that's at position 0, checking to see if that is a letter using the character.isLetter method. And now I just want to repeat and do that same process again, checking to see if the second letter in my monogram or potential monogram is also a letter. And then finally, I'm going to check to see if the last one, character.isLetter, is also a letter. And I think I got too many parentheses in here as things added. Okay, let's add an extra one over here. And then I think I need this one here, and then I think I'm good. Yeah. Okay. So if all three of those are letters and the length was 3, so if the length was 3 and then I checked all the characters and they were all letters, then I want to set the result to be true. And in all other cases, if either everything wasn't a letter or if the length wasn't even 3, then I want the result to be false. And I already initialized it to false, so I don't need to do anything special to cover that. Super. And now finally, I want to communicate my result back to my main program. Anytime you're returning a value from a method, you use the reserved word return and then include the variable or literal value that you want to return. In my example, I want to return the value result. Super. So at this point, I've written my method is valid. Again, all I've done is bundled together the instructions. It's just like writing the algorithm in the main program. I would have all of these same lines, line 22 through 28 in my main program if I was carrying out this algorithm inside my loop. The only thing that's new and different is writing the return and then putting the return value, the variable or literal value that I want to pass back to the main program. And of course, the part where you include the header for the method where you give the signature. That's all of the good information about this particular method. It always starts with public static. It always includes return value. Remember, if your method doesn't return a value, you put the word void here. Void is Java's reserved word that means no return value. Then you pick an identifier and finally include any kind of parameters inside your parameter list. That's the part that's inside the parentheses. Awesome. So now if we want to check to see if our monogram is valid up here, in our main program, we want to call this method to make it leap into action. Because remember, just making the method doesn't actually do anything. In fact, let me make a couple little changes up here, and then we'll run our program. So I got all my red squiggly underlines uncovered. Let's run our program to see if anything happens now that we've added in our isValid method. Let me enter ABC. And my program's telling me ABC is not valid. Why is it saying that? Well, it comes in here, it starts my for loop, and it says enter the monogram. I entered ABC. And then I set the answer to be false and said if the answer is true, print out it's valid. If it's false, print out not valid. And of course, because we haven't changed anything about the answer, it's going to be false. It's going to print not valid. And then it goes up to the top of the loop. Nowhere in here did we tell the computer, I want to launch that is valid method into action and actually check to see if the string mono is a monogram. So to launch it into action, we have to add the method call here in the body of our main method. So remember, anytime we're calling a method, we need to know what the name of the method is. Ours is called isValid. And if we want to, we can use that syntax where you say main.isValid. And then we need to pass in arguments that represents the information I'm passing from the main program into my method. So remember, it's expecting the string that represents the value to be tested. In my loop, the name of that value is mono, so I need to put the word mono in here. That's the information I want to pass over to my isValid method. And then finally, remember, my isValid method returns a Boolean, so I need to capture that back in the main program. I need to say something equals over here. I'm actually gonna do this like this. So I'm going to store the answer that comes back from my isValid method in this variable called answer. It's a Boolean value, so it has the right kind of data type for my return value. Let's see how the execution of our program is different now. I'm going to stop running, break out of the loop, and start the program again. So now when I answer something that is a valid monogram, it's telling me it's valid. That's because as the program starts and I'm running through the for loop for the first time, I received my input for the monogram, the ABC. Then I said, I want to call the method isValid. I want to make that leap into action. I want to pass in the value of mono, that's the ABC. So all of that information is sent over to my isValid method. It executes all my instructions in there, checks to see if it has the right length, if everything's a character and so on. And then it returns the true false value. In this case, ABC is a monogram, so it's going to return true. That value gets stored in my variable called answer. Let's enter something else. Let's do A1B. It tells me that one's not valid, of course, because it has a number in it. Let's try something that's longer than 3 letters. That one's not valid. We can do anything that's 3 letters and that'll be valid. And then after it's gone through 5 iterations of that for loop, the program finishes. One last thing that we should talk through is how to create comments for a method. It's really important to include comments for your methods because somebody else might be reading through your program and they might not be the one who wrote all of the methods, but they might want to appreciate how your method operates and what the big picture is, but they maybe don't want to read all of the individual instructions to puzzle that out on their own. Every method that you write should include a java.comment. And so I'm going to start a java.comment here. Remember, java.comments start with a slash and 2 stars. As soon as I press enter, it's going to pop up with some filled in information. So it's helping me to create the appropriate kind of comment for this method. So IntelliJ already knows you just wrote a method. It already knows that the parameter is called value, and it already knows that it has a return type. So now it's just waiting for you to fill in the details. The top line is a space for you to write a single sentence describing this method. So I'm going to say a test to see if a string is a valid monogram, if I can spell. Awesome. And then again, it filled in everything I need to fill in about my value here. It would be nice if I included extra information about what the value means in my method. So the value is the string to be tested. And then finally, I should put in a description of my return value. In this case, the return value for the method is a Boolean result. It's true if the string is a monogram and false otherwise. Awesome. So now I have everything set up about my java.comment for my method. You always want to include a description of the method, the @param value, and the @return value. You can, of course, write these in by hand before you start writing the method. Sometimes I'll do that. Sometimes I'll write the method header comments first and then fill in the details of the actual implementations kind of one at a time. Other times I'll write the method implementation first. If you go that direction, it's kind of convenient because as soon as you start typing the header comment, IntelliJ will already fill in some of the details for you. It saves you a little bit of typing if you write the method first and then add the comment later. But again, either of them is a completely valid approach. Sometimes I like to put in the method comments first, just to remind myself sort of like an outline of what I'm going to be creating. And then I fill in the details kind of slowly one at a time, testing as I go project to work towards my final project. So today we learned about creating our own method implementation. Again, the most important part is finding an algorithm that you want to encapsulate or group together with a name so that you can launch it into action. Then you have to think through what the parameter requirements are, what the name of the method might be, and what kind of return value you want to have, if any. Once you have those pieces of information, you're all set to fill in the method signature or method header. Of course, you can write all of the statements inside the method body itself. Those represent the statements that should be carried out in this algorithm. And then finally, you wrap it up with a return statement if you have a return value so that the computer knows which piece of information to pass back to your main program. Once you have your main method, or once you have your method implemented, then you're able to call it in your main program. The method call looks just like the method calls that we make to the standard library. The only thing that's new and different is that you use the word main dot in there because we're calling methods that are part of our main class, not part of some other class.